You ever look around your neighborhood and feel like you've stepped into a copy-paste world? Every house the same dull beige, every lawn trimmed to identical lengths, and every mailbox painted with the same approved shade of off-white? Yeah. Welcome to Maplewood Estates, my personal slice of suburban purgatory. When my wife and I first moved in, we thought we were buying peace. A safe neighborhood, quiet streets, a good place to raise our daughter, Lily. But peace here came with fine print. Pages and pages of HOA bylaws so rigid, even the grass probably felt anxious growing. It wasn't long before we met her, the self-appointed queen of conformity, Karen Whitmore, HOA president for life, ruler of all things beige. You couldn't miss Karen. She strutted through the neighborhood like she was inspecting troops, clipboard in hand, phone at the ready to document any potential violation. Her hair was always sprayed into this helmet-like shape, perfectly immovable, much like her opinions. The first time I met her, she wasn't saying hello. She was notifying me that my trash cans were visible from the street. "We like to maintain a certain aesthetic standard here, Mr. Daniels," she said, smiling in that way that wasn't actually a smile. "It's not personal, of course, just the rules." I laughed awkwardly, said I'd take care of it, and moved the bins behind the fence. No big deal. Every neighborhood has its overachievers, right? But I had no idea that this was only the beginning. A few months passed, and Karen's presence became a routine, like a recurring mosquito. She'd stop by with new notices. "Your mailbox flag is slightly faded. The color of your shutters appears to be drifting from HOA-approved taupe. Your daughter's chalk art on the sidewalk is technically graffiti." Yes, sidewalk chalk. That one made my blood boil. Lily was 6, a tiny artist who loved drawing rainbows, flowers, and the occasional cat that looked more like a jelly bean. But to Karen, those pastel doodles were a threat to neighborhood uniformity. "We have to think of property values," she said with that robotic smile. "Imagine if every child started doing this." I imagined it, and it looked beautiful. But instead of saying that, I nodded, washed away the chalk, and told Lily she could draw in the backyard instead. She cried that day, and something small in me cracked. By late spring, Karen and her HOA board, or as I called them, the Beige Brigade, decided to host a community standards review. Basically, a meeting to discuss how we could make the neighborhood more cohesive. Translation, how to make sure everyone stays identical. I went, mostly to see how far this madness went. Karen opened the meeting with a PowerPoint titled, "Preserving Our Community Identity." The first slide was a picture of our street, a row of nearly identical beige homes under a gray sky. "Isn't it lovely?" she beamed. "Consistency is beauty." Some people clapped, others looked bored. Then she dropped the bombshell. "Starting next quarter," she said, "we'll be introducing new exterior paint standards. All homes must conform to one of the approved shades listed in Appendix 14A. This will ensure harmony throughout Maplewood Estates." Someone asked, "Can we still choose our color from the list?" Karen smiled. "Of course. You can pick between sandstone beige, morning mist, and cream white." I swear, even the PowerPoint groaned in despair. When I got home that night, I stood in my driveway staring at my house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-story with faded gray siding and a blue door I'd painted myself years ago. That door wasn't HOA approved, by the way, but it was mine. That little pop of blue had personality. Now it was apparently a problem. The next morning, the official letter arrived, stamped, sealed, and soulless. "Dear homeowner, your property has been identified as non-compliant with the updated HOA color uniformity policy, Section 4.2. Please repaint your exterior to match approved palette options within 60 days to avoid penalties." 60 days. They wanted me to erase every trace of individuality and paint over my home with one of their pre-approved shades of sadness. I showed the letter to my wife. She just sighed. "They're impossible, Mark. Maybe we should just pick a color and get it over with." Maybe. But something inside me resisted. That blue door had seen Lily's first day of school. It had been the backdrop for every family photo. It was part of our story. And now, Karen wanted to turn it beige. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, Karen's voice echoing, "Consistency is beauty." The phrase made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I went out to the porch with a cup of coffee. The street was quiet. Every identical house blending into the darkness like copy-pasted ghosts. That's when it hit me. The sameness wasn't peace. It was erasure. They weren't protecting community values. They were protecting control. And for the first time since moving in, I felt like fighting back. The next morning, I stood in front of my house, watching the sunlight spill over the dull gray walls. The sky was bright, blue, alive, everything the neighborhood wasn't. Lily came out, rubbing her eyes, and said sleepily, "Daddy, why is everything here so boring?" I laughed softly. "That's a good question, kiddo." She looked up at me with that little mischievous smile she got from her mom. "You should paint it rainbow colors." And right there, that sentence, that spark, something clicked. Rainbow. It was wild. Stupid, maybe. Definitely unapproved. But it felt right. A rainbow wasn't just color. It was a message. If Karen wanted uniformity, maybe I'd give her the loudest form of nonconformity imaginable. But before defiance came planning. And before planning came paranoia. I spent the next week reading HOA, bylaws like they were secret government documents. Buried deep in the fine print, I found a clause about decorative expression, vague enough to be exploitable. It stated, "Minor artistic expressions visible from public view may be permitted at the discretion of the HOA board." That word, discretion, was dangerous. But it also left room to argue, room to create. I wasn't just going to paint a house, I was going to build a statement, and if Karen and her beige army wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The decision didn't come with fireworks or some dramatic movie moment. It came in quiet, stubborn determination. That same night, Mark sat at his dining table surrounded by HOA papers, old paint brochures, and a half-finished cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. What had started as frustration slowly turned into fascination. Every word of those HOA documents became a clue. Every clause a potential weapon. He began reading between the lines, studying the exact phrasing of every rule related to exterior maintenance and decorative modifications. What stood out to him was not what was said, but what wasn't. The rules were designed to limit, not prohibit. The HOA assumed that people would comply out of fear, not that someone would challenge their boundaries. Mark realized that the only real authority the HOA had was intimidation. They relied on homeowners' unwillingness to fight. That realization changed everything. The next morning, he took the first real step. He began gathering inspiration, color palettes, design concepts, artistic murals from around the world. What started as curiosity quickly grew into obsession. His search history was now filled with color theory, architectural expression, and the psychological effects of vibrant environments. Every article he read pushed him closer to the idea that color wasn't rebellion. It was life. Still, there was risk. He knew the HOA could fine him, maybe even take legal action if they wanted to make an example out of him. His wife was understandably nervous. She didn't say much, but her, silence spoke volumes. It wasn't that she disagreed with him. She was just tired of fighting. They had already endured too many warnings, too many cold stares from neighbors afraid to be seen, siding against the HOA. Mark couldn't blame her, but he couldn't let it go either. There was something about the idea of that rainbow house that had rooted itself deep inside him, an act of defiance wrapped in color. Over the next few days, he began planning the logistics. He knew he couldn't do it all at once, or the HOA would notice and intervene. It would have to be gradual, disguised as normal maintenance. He started by prepping the exterior, claiming to be power washing and testing paint samples. The HOA couldn't argue with that. Maintenance was encouraged. What they didn't know was that every sample was part of a larger plan. A small splash of red here, a test of yellow there, faint enough not to alarm anyone. He was mapping out the colors in secret, building his rebellion in plain sight. During this phase, he made a few discreet visits to local paint suppliers. One of them, a small independent store on the edge of town, became his silent partner in crime. The owner didn't ask too many questions, just smiled knowingly when Mark requested gallons of vivid pigments labeled under generic color codes. They would show up on invoices as test materials, nothing suspicious. Back home, he worked mostly at night. The neighborhood was quiet, most lights out by 10. Under the pale glow of a street lamp, he'd start painting small sections, using shadows to conceal his progress. It was slow, methodical work, each brushstroke layered with caution and purpose. There was something therapeutic about it. Every streak of color across the bland gray walls felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of something that had been slowly taken from him since the day he moved in. Days turned to weeks, and the transformation began to take shape. The house wasn't fully rainbow yet, just glimpses. A hint of turquoise under the eaves, a shimmer of orange near the porch, a subtle pink reflection on the side paneling. To most passers-by, it looked like a home in renovation. But Mark knew the truth. The colors were spreading, just like the courage he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He started noticing something interesting. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now lingered when walking their dogs. Some gave small nods or half smiles, as if silently cheering him on. Others still clung to the HOA's shadow, pretending not to notice. But the air felt different, lighter, charged with possibility. Karen, of course, noticed. She always did. Her patrols became more frequent. Her car slowed each time she passed his driveway. But for once, she didn't have anything concrete to report. Everything Mark had done was technically within maintenance guidelines. He was careful, maddeningly so. Then came the day he decided to stop hiding. It was a Saturday morning when he finally stood back, roller in hand, and realized he was ready. The base layers were in place. The plan was solid. It was time for the reveal, the point of no return. He didn't announce it. He didn't post about it or warn anyone. He simply began. One section at a time, the dull gray gave way to radiant streaks of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. The colors melted into each other like a sunrise blooming across his walls. By noon, a third of the house shimmered with vibrant energy that could be seen from the other side of the cul-de-sac. The effect was immediate. Cars slowed. People stopped. Even the air seemed to hum with curiosity. The neighborhood, once uniform and quiet, now had a pulse. Inside, Mark's wife stood at the window watching him. For the first time, she smiled. Really smiled. As if the sight of those colors finally reminded her of something they'd lost. That tiny spark of joy was all the encouragement he needed. By sunset, half the house was alive. The Schul 20 rainbow wasn't complete yet, but it was undeniable. There was no hiding anymore. The HOA would see it. Karen would lose her mind, and there would be consequences. But standing there, paint-stained and exhausted, Mark didn't feel afraid. He felt free. The house looked like hope. Messy, bright, unapologetic. It stood defiant in the middle of a world that demanded sameness. As the last light faded, he stepped back and whispered to himself that it was worth it. Every letter, every threat, every sleepless night. Worth it. because this was more than paint. It was protest. And the war with the HOA was about to begin. The next morning, the sun rose brighter than usual, or maybe it only seemed that way because of the colors now spilling across Mark's front yard. Where there had once been a uniform gray facade, now stood something extraordinary, half-finished, bold, and unapologetically alive. The rainbow had begun to bloom. It didn't take long for word to spread. In neighborhoods like Maplewood Estates, news traveled faster than Wi-Fi. By mid-morning, curious neighbors had found reasons to wander outside, checking their mail twice, sweeping already clean driveways, walking dogs that didn't exist. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the spectacle. The house looked like an art installation among a row of lifeless beige boxes. Each hue seemed to defy the monotony surrounding it, the sunlight bouncing off every painted curve like the walls themselves were breathing. Mark stood back and watched from across the street, coffee in hand, his heart thudding with a mix of pride and anticipation. For once, his home didn't blend into the background. It sang. He noticed people's faces, some wide-eyed with admiration, some whispering in disbelief. A few smiled, as if remembering what joy looked like. And somewhere down the street, Karen's SUV slowed to a crawl. She didn't get out at first. She just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house like it was a personal attack. Eventually, she drove off, but Mark knew what that meant. The email would come soon. Or maybe the letter, printed and formal, citing yet another rule. But for now, he didn't care. By noon, the painting continued. The transformation was deliberate and methodical, each brushstroke a declaration. Red melted into orange, orange into yellow, a seamless cascade of defiance that stretched across the siding, around windows, and beneath the eaves. The air buzzed with energy. Even those who disapproved couldn't deny it. The house was beautiful. Not just because of the colors, but because it was something rare in Maplewood. Real. It took 3 full days to finish the job. 3 days of sunshine, sweat, and a growing crowd of spectators. Kids began stopping by after school to watch. Some even cheered when the final streaks of violet were added, as if witnessing a victory they didn't fully understand. By the time the last wall was done, the rainbow house stood radiant under the setting sun. Each panel reflected a different shade as the light shifted, creating a living mosaic of color that seemed to move with the day. It was more than a house now. It was a symbol. That night, the silence felt heavier than usual. The street, always orderly and quiet, seemed unsure how to react to what had just happened. Behind curtained windows, neighbors whispered. Some admired him in secret. Others planned their complaints. And in one house, Karen sat surrounded by bylaws and policy binders, her jaw tight, her pride wounded. The first letter came the next morning. Neatly folded, slipped under his door, printed on HOA letterhead with the cold precision of bureaucracy. It outlined multiple violations, each referencing sections of the HOA code Mark already knew by heart. It ended with a demand to restore the property to compliance within 10 business days or face escalating penalties. He read it twice, set it down, and smiled. It was exactly what he'd expected. The first shot fired. Over the following week, the tension thickened. Karen began making her rounds daily, her SUV parked at the curb, engine idling, camera flashing as she documented evidence. She avoided confrontation but made her presence known, her silence louder than words. Yet something unexpected happened. The more she pushed, the more people noticed the absurdity of it all. Neighbors who had once stayed neutral started quietly showing support. Some stopped by to say how refreshing the colors looked. Others sent anonymous notes thanking him for doing what they'd always wanted to do, but never dared. Even the local paper got wind of it. One afternoon, a reporter showed up, notebook in hand, snapping photos of the now famous Rainbow House. The article appeared online that evening under the headline, Homeowners' Colorful Rebellion Challenges HOA Norms. The photo accompanying the piece was stunning. The house glowing against a cloudy sky, standing alone and proud among an army of beige. The story spread quickly, shared across social media with comments like legend and hero of suburbia. Karen, of course, was furious. The HOA's inbox overflowed with messages from outsiders mocking their obsession with conformity. The board scheduled an emergency meeting, but even within the group, cracks began to show. Not everyone agreed with Karen's crusade anymore. The neighborhood was changing, not physically but in spirit. The Rainbow House had done something unexpected. It gave people courage. Still, the HOA wasn't done. A few days later, another notice arrived. This one was more aggressive, threatening daily fines and potential legal action. They called it a blatant violation of community aesthetics, claiming the colors were offensive to neighborhood standards. Mark knew the fight was coming, but instead of fear, he felt something else: clarity. He wasn't just defending paint, he was defending the right to exist outside the box, to live without apology. He didn't respond to the letter. He didn't back down. Instead, he made small improvements. Planted flowers that matched the house's colors, installed soft outdoor lights that made the rainbow glow at night. It wasn't provocation. It was art. Soon, people began driving through Maplewood just to see it. Strangers stopped for pictures. It became a landmark, a statement that rippled beyond its walls. And with every new visitor, every photo shared online, the HOA's control slipped further away. Karen tried to fight it, but the tide had turned. Her words, once treated as law, began to sound desperate. The power she'd wielded for years was unraveling, all because one man decided beige wasn't the only option. The Rainbow House had started as rebellion. Now, it was revolution. And for Mark, it was only the beginning. The calm after the rainbow didn't last long. What began as murmurs of disbelief soon hardened into official outrage. Karen and her board returned with a new kind of precision, the kind reserved for people who believed paperwork was warfare. Letters came in waves. First the fines, then the legal warnings, then the threats disguised as requests for cooperation. Each envelope landed with the same sterile tone, printed on thick paper, sealed with the authority of people who thought ink equaled power. At first, Mark stacked them neatly on the kitchen counter, unopened. He knew what they contained: repetition, intimidation, and a desperate attempt to reclaim control. But ignoring them didn't make them disappear. It only made them louder. Soon, the letters began arriving twice a week, hand-delivered by volunteers who avoided eye contact. The HOA had moved from annoyance to retaliation. They started small. The first tactic was humiliation. An official notice was pinned to the community bulletin board labeling Mark's home as non-compliant. His address sat there in bold type like a public accusation. Neighbors saw it every time they checked for announcements. But the plan backfired. Instead of shame, curiosity grew. Visitors increased, cameras multiplied, and the rainbow shimmered brighter against the rising tension. The more the HOA pushed, the more visible the house became. Next came the legal posturing. Karen hired an attorney known for his strict interpretation of property covenants. The letters changed tone, no longer scolding, but threatening. They spoke of injunctions, of forced repainting, of the HOA's right to impose liens. It was meant to scare, to corner Mark into surrender. He didn't flinch. The night he received the first formal threat, he stayed up reading every statute he could find. He learned the difference between HOA authority and homeowner rights, memorized clauses, highlighted contradictions. Each page fueled him further. The same rules they used to intimidate were riddled with ambiguity, vague phrases that leaned on interpretation. Karen had built her empire on fear, not law. When the HOA scheduled a disciplinary hearing, Mark attended calmly, prepared, and meticulous. He documented every notice, every fine, every contradictory statement. He gathered local news coverage and the flood of supportive comments online. The moment the board tried to corner him, he countered with clarity and evidence. The more they spoke, the more foolish they sounded. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about how the meeting didn't go as planned. Rumor had it that even some board members questioned Karen's leadership afterward. The rebellion was spreading quietly, like color bleeding through canvas. Yet the retaliation escalated. The HOA began inspecting his property weekly, citing minor infractions unrelated to paint, grass length, garden decorations, even the placement of a recycling bin. It was harassment disguised as procedure. Mark kept meticulous records of every visit, noting times, dates, and photos. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. He knew how these battles worked. Document everything, respond formally, never lose composure. While the HOA doubled down, the outside world paid attention. The local newspaper followed up with another article titled, "The Rainbow That Refuses to Fade." A regional news channel aired a short segment featuring drone footage of the neighborhood, a uniform stretch of beige homes interrupted by one house blazing with color. The narration framed it as a debate about freedom of expression versus community order. Overnight, the story went viral. Support poured in from across the country. Social media turned the Rainbow House into a symbol of individuality, a meme of defiance against suburban conformity. The HOA's attempt to silence had turned into amplification. Karen couldn't handle it. Her control, once absolute, was unraveling faster than she could organize her files. Board members resigned quietly. Some neighbors stopped enforcing petty rules altogether, tired of the tension. Mark watched it all unfold with a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. The battle had become bigger than him. What started as frustration over beige paint had evolved into a movement about choice, creativity, and courage. The final blow came when the county's code enforcement office responded to the HOA's complaints. After inspection, they found no legal violations, no safety hazards, no zoning issues, nothing that breached municipal codes. The paint was unconventional but lawful. The HOA's authority ended at aesthetics, not legality. That decision gutted Karen's campaign. The fines were suspended, the threats raided into silence, and the once boastful board retreated into administrative obscurity. Karen remained, but her voice carried no weight anymore. The neighborhood, once rigid and silent, now hummed with quiet liberation. In the following weeks, small shifts appeared everywhere. A door painted soft blue, a fence adorned with flowers, a mailbox sporting a hand-painted design. Subtle acts of resistance, each one inspired by the rainbow house that refused to bow. Mark didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't need to. His victory stood visible from every street corner, a monument to what happens when one person decides enough is enough. At night, under the porch lights, the colors glowed softly against the dark. The house no longer looked rebellious. It looked alive. The HOA's retaliation had failed not because the rules changed, but because the people did. Fear lost its power once someone showed it could be ignored. And in the middle of Maplewood Estates, the rainbow remained, unchanged, unashamed, and unforgettable. Time has a strange way of softening even the harshest edges. What once felt like a battleground slowly turned into something else, something quieter, almost peaceful. The rainbow house, once seen as a symbol of rebellion, began to blend into the rhythm of everyday life, not as an eyesore, but as a landmark of courage. Months passed, and the fury that once consumed the HOA faded into whispers. Karen still lived in the neighborhood, but her reign had ended. The board was restructured, the bylaws reviewed, and new members, younger, more open-minded, stepped in. Their first act wasn't to repaint or punish, but to listen. For the first time in years, people attended HOA meetings willingly. There was laughter instead of tension, debate instead of decree. The uniformity that once defined Maplewood Estates had cracked, and through that crack, color had found a permanent place. The Rainbow House changed more than property values. It changed people. The same neighbors who once scowled from their driveways began to greet each other more often. Some even asked Mark about paint brands and finishes, curious, inspired. Slowly, doors turned navy, shutters became sage, and flower beds bloomed in colors previously forbidden by visual harmony clauses. It wasn't an overnight revolution. It was quieter, a steady ripple that spread one bold choice at a time. Local artists began visiting, taking photos for community art projects. Kids posed for graduation pictures on the rainbow steps. The story appeared in magazines, featured as a tale of creative resistance. A place that once stood for control now represented freedom. Even the city noticed. A muralist from downtown approached Mark, asking permission to paint a smaller version of the rainbow facade on a public wall. Not for politics, but for hope. The mural went up months later, signed in tiny letters at the corner, inspired by the house that wouldn't fade. Mark never sought fame. His motivation was never to become a hero or icon. He simply wanted to live without being told what his home should look like. Yet somehow, that simple desire echoed far beyond his street. The house became a pilgrimage for those who had their own battles with HOAs, neighbors, or restrictive systems. People stopped by to take pictures. Some even left small notes tucked under the porch mat. Letters of gratitude from strangers who found courage in his defiance. The transformation of Maplewood Estates went deeper than paint. There was something symbolic about how the colors aged. The red softened under the sun. The blue deepened with rain. The yellow shimmered in twilight. Time didn't erase them. It made them real. Like scars that told a story, every shade carried the memory of resistance. Karen eventually sold her house. The for sale sign appeared one morning without ceremony. No one knew where she went, and no one asked. Some said she moved to another development where rules still held, where beige still ruled. Others joked she probably started a new HOA, the moment she unpacked. But her departure marked the end of an era, not of order, but of oppression disguised as order. In her place, the neighborhood grew into something better. People still cared for their homes, still maintained standards, but now it came from pride, not pressure. The HOA evolved into what it should have been all along, a community, not a council. Years later, when the Rainbow House's story resurfaced online again, Mark read through the comments quietly. Some called him a legend. Others thanked him for showing that standing up, even for something small, could ripple into something greater. He smiled, not because of the praise, but because it reminded him of the day he first opened that beige-colored HOA letter and decided simply to say no. Every movement begins with one refusal. And sometimes it's not loud speeches or protests that spark change. Sometimes it's a paintbrush dipped in color, a wall that refuses to blend in, a homeowner who decides conformity isn't worth the price of peace. At sunset, the Rainbow House glowed again, bathed in gold light, reflecting across the quiet street. The air was still, but alive, the kind of calm that follows after a storm when everything feels new. For Mark, it was never just about paint. It was about taking back the right to live authentically, to exist in color in a world obsessed with control. And for everyone who walked past that house, from curious neighbors to strangers stopping for a photo, it whispered the same quiet message. You don't have to blend in to belong. Years rolled by quietly, the kind of time that softens memories but never truly fades them. Seasons passed, the paint weathered, and the story of the rainbow house drifted into local legend. But even as the colors dulled under years of sunlight, the message behind them only grew stronger. Mark's life slowed into something peaceful. The noise of meetings, notices, and arguments had long disappeared. The HOA still existed, but it was different now, a far gentler version of its former self. Rules still hung in place, but they were more like guidelines, flexible and fair. There were no more wars over mailbox height or grass shade. The community had learned something deeper than regulation could ever teach. The Rainbow House stood as a quiet monument. Children who were once too young to understand the controversy now biked past it without a second thought. To them, it was just the colorful house, a place that made their street brighter. New families moved in and out, each bringing something new to the neighborhood. Gardens grew wilder, fences became more creative, and art started appearing in unexpected places. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was identity. Every now and then, a stranger would still stop outside the house, phone in hand, taking a picture. Sometimes they'd linger, studying the lines of color that had started this quiet revolution. Mark would notice them from the window and smile, remembering the storm that came before this calm. The once beige neighborhood had evolved, not into chaos, but into balance. The HOA hadn't been destroyed. It had been redefined. Its new president, a soft-spoken teacher named Claire, often reminded residents of the story that reshaped their rules. She called it the lesson in color. Even now, the phrase lived on, whispered during meetings, mentioned in local papers, referenced online whenever someone faced their own version of HOA tyranny. The Rainbow House became a symbol for anyone who'd ever been told to stay in line, tone it down, or follow the rules, because that's how it's done. The funny thing was, Mark never set out to inspire anyone. He only wanted to be left alone, to live without being dictated to. Yet in doing so, he had unknowingly given others the courage to push back too. Years later, when the house finally needed repainting, Mark stood before it with a brush in hand and an old bucket of primer. The original rainbow had faded, the once vivid streaks now muted and cracked. For a long time, he just stared at it, wondering if maybe it was time for something quieter. But then, he saw it. Across the street, a new family had moved in. Their little girl stood by her porch, painting a wooden birdhouse with streaks of pink, orange, and blue, every brushstroke wild and free. Her parents didn't stop her. They watched her proudly, smiling at the mess she made. Mark chuckled softly, lowering the brush. The message didn't need to be repainted. It was already alive in them. So instead of covering the rainbow, he restored it. Not perfectly, not professionally, but lovingly. The colors shone again, just as bold, just as unapologetic. At sunset, when the light hit the walls just right, the house looked like it was glowing from within. It didn't stand out the way it used to, maybe because the rest of the neighborhood had finally caught up. There were blues, greens, yellows, and even a lavender door 2 houses down. Uniformity was gone. Harmony had taken its place. And as the street lights flickered on, the Rainbow House stood in quiet triumph, not as an act of defiance anymore, but as a symbol of what happens when one person dares to live authentically in a world that demands sameness. The HOA had demanded uniformity. He gave them unity instead, in color, in spirit, in the freedom to be different. Some revolutions don't roar, they shine, and under the evening sky, the rainbow still did.